Hello, this is Joe Corneli. I'm here with Anna Jordanous, and we're going to talk about Writer's Workshop. I'm going to let Anna introduce the talk, and then I'll start talking, and she'll jump in as well. So over to you, Anna.
Hello, so our talk is entitled Implementing Feedback in Creative Systems and a Workshop Approach. And it's by myself, Anna Jordanous from Kent, and Joseph Corneli from Goldsmiths.
And we can't be there today in person, sorry, but we're trying our best to kind of simulate that. And if possible, I'm going to be around later on for questions. So yeah, here's the talk. We're thinking about it, the challenge of computational modeling in creativity in particular. So this is one of the things in AI that we've been particularly involved with. And feedback and learning from experience are two of the key aspects of the creative process. That seems pretty not debatable. You can't just create in a vacuum, certainly, and you learn as you go. So for humans, this has been going on for years. You go to art school, or sometimes if you're a creative writer, you go to this somewhat more informal thing called a writer's workshop, where you get feedback, and that's going to be the theme of the talk, but we're going to position that as a somewhat more general model for studying creativity in the first place and studying feedback as well. So, yeah. Anna, what do you think about the background? Because this has been studied by a number of people already. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so looking specifically at feedback within computational creativity, Pease and Colton proposed the IDEA model a couple of years ago, which is the Iterative Development Expression Appreciation model, basically embedding feedback at every step, seeing the creative process as a feedback loop. And Pablo Vivas and Carlos Leon also talked about the ICTIVS model, which I believe they'll also be talking about later, which includes a lot of introspection and thinking about the observer in the process of being creative. Rob Saunders and others have done a lot of work with social creativity, where the creative system is a social entity that can converse with others. Kaz Grace and Mary Lou Marr have looked a lot about surprise within creativity and how that works in a computational context. And Alison Pease and others have looked a lot at computational serendipity. We're all aware of, more generally, the use of things like pattern mining, so you can learn from feedback. We've given an example there of musical pattern detection, work by David Meredith and his colleagues. And finally, we can look at Gordon Pask's work using conversations to learn from feedback.
Yeah, which is often, I would say that's a good kind of foreground. If you're familiar with Pask, he did something quite similar of conversational participants carrying out some actions and observations and looking at what was going on in the conversation and reflecting on that. So again, to make that a bit more concrete, we're going to look at the writer's workshop setting. One of the best things about them is that they use a very prescribed format of activities. So, you know, although we're interested in the kind of creativity that goes on within the workshop of detailed examination of the work and possibly friendly debates, the best thing for our purposes is that it's a step-by-step model. So we'll show you that on the next slide. So the authors come with some work that's ready to present, and typically the presenting author would read a short sample of the work, although that may have all been read by the participants already, and they might then just ask a question. And something is important about the intention of this workshop, that it's, you know, you're usually presenting work in progress, and that the workshop is meant to help the author improve that as well as learn. Although in some cases you could workshop already polished things and look at what really is going on inside that work, and again use that as a learning activity. So the main feature of the workshop is that the presented work is then discussed and constructively critiqued by the other participants, not the author. Often what will happen is the commentators will summarize the work and say what works for them inside of it, what they like about it or perhaps don't like. But they often, they well, always focus on what's in the work. It's not meant to be a time to sort of bash the author or laud the author. They're really digging in to something that could be called a deep reading of the work. And at this point, the author is simply listening and might take notes, and he or she can ask questions for clarification at the end, but they don't rebut the things that the commentators have said. So if the commentator says, the introduction really didn't work for me, the author just takes that and thinks about it later, and that's the final step, which is effectively an offline phase that they may take their notes and reflect back on what's going on. So this is what happens with humans, and you can kind of see how these steps are clear. We're going to progressively clarify that a bit more in the talk and look at how computers could follow these same steps. So jumping right in with this figure, to turn that into something like an agent-based model, it's worth seeing what's the flow of control. So we sort of assume that the text has been generated already in the workshop. Like maybe it's a poem and the person comes, or in this case, computer comes ready to present them. And they pass it off to some other module, which generates comments. This F, it's the same F on the top and the bottom row. Once you've got this F, you try to understand what the feedback was saying. So, what do you mean you didn't like the introduction? Or what do you mean that this character development is weak? I don't really understand where that's coming from. And this red line indicates that the author's back asking questions of the possibly quite detailed feedback, which came from the critic or critics. And so that process may be iterative, to go back and explain the feedback that was given. Usually not too many loops would happen in practice in an actual writer's workshop. But then this X becomes like a problem to solve, so that the presenting author is left thinking, wow, yeah, that character development really was weak. How the heck am I going to solve that in my future work? And that problem gets passed to a code generator, which could then go back and obviously update the poem or the story or whatever it was, or go back and update the modules that do text generation, or possibly at least touch on some of the modules that this the person or the agent who was the presenter would use to make comments in the future. So this code generator is admittedly a bit of a magic box, but the main thing is to update the story, and then it could kind of percolate out from there, the ability to update other facets of that computational agent. So at least this gives you a flavor of what it would look like computationally. We're going to walk through a quick demo of how that might work. Now, of course, we're going to do this in English to make it comprehensible to you. We'll talk a bit more a little later on about how this could be computational to how this could be presented for computers. So you'd need a process language that would allow some of these things to be expressed, but use a little bit of imagination. This is just meant to give you a flavor. So, the example is from a paper by Colton and Charnley, yeah, we're going to simulate workshopping a poem. So we're going to do that line by line. So take it away, Flow.
Okay, so Flow is the system that's generated this poem. It's now called Flower.
Yeah.
And the poem: I hear the souls of the damned waiting in hell. I feel a malevolent spectre hovering just behind me. It must be his birthday.
Okay, and one of the participating systems says, I think the third line detracts from the spooky effect. I don't see why it's included. The system says, well, it's meant to be humorous, obviously. In fact, it reminds me of the poem you presented yesterday, at which point the moderator might say, hey, let's discuss one poem at a time. So there's some ground rules. So we move on to the next lines of the poem.
Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent.
These lines are interesting, but they sound a bit like you're working from a template or like you're quoting from something else. Maybe try an analogy. For example, you mentioned birthdays. You could consider an analogy to the conflicted feelings of someone who knows in advance about her surprise birthday party.
Thank you for your feedback. My only question is, System B, how did you come up with that analogy? It's quite clever.
Well, okay, I've just emailed you the code. So this is the kind of thing that could happen. And it's worth pointing out that the surprise birthday party was, a bit of a surprise to everyone, because in the first slide it was not looking very useful, and this one of the systems has kind of turned that around and made it interesting. So yeah, let's go on. So this is one more kind of redescription of the model in perhaps a bit more formal terms. So again, I mentioned we'd need a process language for talking about feedback. So highlighting what is the third line, what does it mean for something to be an analogy, what does it mean for some poem to be on topic or not on topic. All of those things we dealt with in our little simulated dialogue were perhaps questionable from a computational standpoint, but this formalism, say, just looks at the high level abstraction that we've already shown you, and thinks about the process steps that would actually have to happen. You build a model of the text you're listening to, you say what's of interest there, you generate feedback relative to those interesting things, and so on and so forth. And it's worth highlighting the last line there, updating your point of view. This E stands for experience, and really all of these functions should take experience as another argument, but it's elided before. So modeling experience and what does that mean is another thing. So we're obviously raising a lot of questions here. I wanted to just point to a little bit of current work. It isn't mentioned in the paper that much, but right now I'm working with the same flower system we mentioned before to automatically generate flowcharts, test their outputs, and rewrite them according to certain criteria. And I wanted to point out that just touches on some of the steps here in the workshop. So it's something that we can hopefully progressively fill in. So yeah, let's go ahead. So there's a lot of things to continue to implement. I've mentioned some of them. We need an awareness of the protocol. We need a suitable communication platform and some kind of moderator that can move things along. We need a controlled vocabulary, which I mentioned, perhaps an ontology of what's there in written works. Yep, this continues on the next slide. We need the systems to be able to come up with some kinds of questions to investigate. So I mentioned, instead of just presenting the work, often the author will come with a specific question. Is this introduction working? Is this character development right? And they'll ask those questions to the audience. And as I mentioned, prior experience is relevant at each step. And the systems should also be prepared to not just give feedback and not just present poems, but also give feedback, but also evaluate the helpfulness or lack of helpfulness of the feedback that they're getting. And that could help train the system as a whole. So now we're going to jump ahead to a preliminary evaluation of this model. I realize we haven't given you a whole lot to go on about evaluating work, but we're going to evaluate the model as a model. And one of the ways we're going to look at that is the workshop is meant to support learning by the participating agents or systems. And the question is really, are we getting anything out of this model that we couldn't get just by scripting it or generating things randomly or something like that? So we're going to look at it through the lens of serendipitous discovery. And there's some patterns of serendipity which were developed by a guy named Van Andel in 1994. And we'll show you a little bit of one on the next slide. So let's go ahead.
So let's look at one particular pattern of serendipity that Van Andel came up with, which is the successful error pattern. What successful error is when something doesn't work in its intended context, but it works in another way. So when there was a use found for a particular non-sticky glue that had been developed, it turned out to be very useful for post-it notes. So here, let's have a look at the writer's workshop within the context of successful error. So, interesting idea of the surprise birthday party. Oh, I heard you say surprise, and the feedback is I don't like surprises. The question, to clarify, not even a little bit, you don't even like surprises a little bit. And the note to self is try smaller surprises next time.
Yeah. So it's quite nice because you move from you move from one thing to something you wouldn't expect. The presenter in that case thought they were showing a great idea. They've ended up learning something. This is the sort of thing that the writer's workshop style dialogue can support. And there's some other patterns that we noticed. Then outsider. So yeah, you're expecting you don't know it all as the presenting author. So you're creating an opportunity for someone who wasn't on the creative team to share some ideas that you wouldn't have come up with yourself. As I mentioned, you might trigger revisions to the creative process and not just the work itself. So you might change the way you write or the way you ask questions or the way you make comments on other people's work as a result of the feedback you received. And of course, the author might not understand what the feedback means. They can clarify that using follow-up questions, or even the fact that they don't understand can be noted, and that instances where participants don't understand each other may be almost as interesting as the cases where they do, as long as they're able to observe that and think about how that lack of communication could be changed in future communications. So yeah, that really brings us to the end. There's a few conclusions, take-home points from this. So we've highlighted that computational models of learning from feedback are really fundamental. We showed you how the workshop could fit in almost a general dialogue setting. We've shown how, at least in theory, this model can be functionally implemented, and furthermore, that can happen modularly with different pieces getting filled in as we go. And finally, our evaluation suggests that the workshop can produce serendipitous effects. So we think it's worth developing. And yeah, we want to leave you with one final thought. Maybe 2016 is too soon, but perhaps in 2017, we'll have an implementation of a writer's workshop agent-based model that can peer review systems, or where the systems participate doing their own peer review in a future workshop. So I want to leave you with that. Thanks a lot for the talk. And like I said, I'm going to aim to be there live to answer questions by Skype. So hope that works. If not, we'll see you around. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening.